Well, all right, all right, all right. Happy Friday, guys. It's Coach Lois back for another live episode back on Fridays. If you've been following me for almost 2.5 years and over 250 episodes in, I usually love doing my shows on Fridays. It gives you time to just really consume the content over the weekend. I think everyone loves Fridays and having that opportunity to bring you some hope today, some encouragement, some different kind of inspiration today. Here at Healthy and Wealthy and Wise, we've been mixing it up since my 200th episode and my coming out of the spiritual closet, really talking about the root causes of dis-ease, health challenges, as well as wealth challenges. And how do you trust your own innate wisdom, which today's topic is going to be talking about some different kind of wisdom that I've never had on my podcast. And Scott, I don't know, when we first met, you're like my brother from another mother. Like there was every time we talk, I'm like, really? You also know this stuff? Oh my gosh, how did that not come up in our first year? I've known you since 2021, maybe?
I can't even believe that.
It feels a lot longer, probably many lifetimes. And
Yes,
I know you've had a career as a lawyer. You come from a very interesting childhood. We've talked about that when you were on my Suicide Awareness Month,
yes.
A while back, and just so grateful to have you here today talking about Norse mythology and how that impacts you, and I think your health, your wealth, and how we can tap into that wisdom. So I'm just going to turn it over to you also as my interviewer of the Webdelics podcast. You're the amazing host of that brand new, amazing, my favorite podcast now. Thanks to you for being so amazing and having me on that show. So tell us a little bit about you, and then we'll dive into all of the good stuff.
Thank you. Before I go any further, though, I'll take a second to talk about Webdelics. That's WEBDELICS.com. And it is basically the WebMD of psychedelics. I am the host of that show, and really it exists to explore the myths around plant medicine, to get rid of the stories or the beliefs that people have about them that aren't true and get at the truth. The purpose of Webdelics is to provide a credible and unbiased exploration into the world of plant medicine. And I want to start off our conversation by mentioning that for a couple of reasons. First of all, I have to be candid. I, like you, have done hundreds of podcast episodes. I've hosted 4 podcasts since 2020. And the episode that we taped featuring you, which is the 3rd episode of the podcast, was at the time the most powerful podcast episode I have ever taped. Mm-hmm. And there have been people that have listened to that podcast. They may not have really been that interested in plant medicine or psychedelics, but for the fact that they followed me as the host onto that platform. And I've gotten phone messages or voicemails or just comments through DM or in personal conversation saying that this was an episode that completely changed everything for them. And so anyone who is a fan of Lois Kofi or who cares about personal transformation, wellness, mental health, any of that, they have to listen to your episode 3 of the Webdelics podcast at webdelics.com. Yes, that is a blatant promo, but that's because what you did was share something that was truly beautiful and profound, and the world needs to hear.
Oh, bless your heart. And I'll drop that show in our show notes today, as well as all of your amazing content. And that's what I loved about you. And I didn't actually understand when you said you were the myth slayer when we first met, because again, I wasn't ready. I was unpacking a lot with plant medicine and really going in deep dive with my religion wound and all of these, busting up these limiting beliefs of these things we've been programmed as kids and so on and so forth. And when I discovered we have, other things in common, which I'll let you tell us how you became known as the Myth Slayer and whatever else you want to share with us. And I love that you also bring that to the Webdelics, because there's so many judgments, well, whatever you want to call them, misconceptions, perceptions about a lot of things in life. And you really help uncover all of the juicy possibilities and potentialities of things. So how did you become the Myth Slayer?
Thank you. Actually, transitioning a little bit from the topic of plant medicine into the topic of mythology as a personal and professional transformation tool, I will say there is a common thread there. And that is that the language of myth is the language of the subconscious. And the language of the subconscious is the language of plant medicine. And myths have been with us as a culture, across cultures, for thousands and thousands of years. And that's because they speak in this one element of the human experience that has had total continuity. And that is the language of the subconscious. All of our life outcomes are ultimately driven by the stories that we tell ourselves. Myths are, and the characters within them are representations of that. And so as I've gone on my own spiritual and transformational journey through hills and valleys that we can discuss as much or as little as you see fit, I came to understand that the key to my own growth, becoming self-actualized and who I was meant to be in this universe, involved unlocking and understanding the role of myth vis-a-vis my own life. I've loved myth since I was a little boy. I've studied them my entire life. But it wasn't until I was facing existential crises and then moving to the other side that I understood the true power of their ability to transform human experience.
Wow, that just blew my mind, because I didn't put two and two together. I mean, and it makes total sense, right? How the myths that we've grown up with, and I'm going to let you define and use examples in whatever way you deem fit, are really a huge part of our subconscious and also a part of our imagination, like our creativity and all of that kind of stuff. But they're a huge, depending on how you look at it, part of our lives that can also be very, we'll just say, paralyzing, destructive, because the subconscious is such a huge part of our world.
Absolutely. Let's start with a question that you asked a second ago, if I may.
Yeah.
And that is, well, what is a myth? And I will start with that because it's a question that is deceptively simple. Thousands upon thousands of pages for thousands of years have been written about exactly what mythology is. Myths have existed for as long as we know about recorded history. So clearly they resonate. And as long as they've existed, people have attempted to study them and categorize them, as well as define what they are. Now, some people might say, for instance, oh, they're purely poetic or metaphorical representations that speak as to the human experience. Other people might say they are pre-scientific explanations for the way the world works. Some people might say that they're just entertainment that people told themselves, for thousands of years. Others say that they are purely manifestations of cultural or personal situations that people or societies go through. The best definition, and the one that is most relevant to our conversation that I've encountered, is in a great book called The Philosophy of Mythology, which essentially defines mythology as the group of stories, traditions, lore, that sort of thing, that define a people. People may live in different locations, there may be different cities, but what unites them as a people and what designates them in their own minds as people are their mythology. Now, let's take that down a little bit. I said earlier that mythology resonates and has resonated because it speaks to the unified subconscious experience of all humanity. I would then argue on a personal level, if mythology on a social level and a cultural level defines a people, the mythology that we live and experience defines who and what we are, who and what you are, Lois Kofi, as well as anyone watching or listening. The metaphors, the stories, and the ultimately the drivers that they are is their personal mythology. And that personal mythology can make or break you.
That's so powerful. And I'd like to give our audience, because I know we're going to get to Norse mythology, but there's also Greek mythology. But I think to put it into context, you said the personal mythology that brings people together. Then you're talking about pretty much all religions, all cities, all cultures, all insert, tribes, nations. Everybody has a personal mythology that they were born into, right?
Yes, and that they develop. Now, they are, of course, at a cultural level, very specific. And there are those, including a very famous author by the name of Joseph Campbell, who would argue that essentially all mythology is identical. It's what he calls a monomyth, which we have known in the popular consciousness as the hero's journey. That, however, although it's very, very popular, it's captured the public's imagination, it actually is very, very controversial. And in fact, I would even say close to being dismissed by many elements of the academic community that study folklore and mythology. And it is for the exact reason that the myths of specific cultures relate to the individual experiences of that culture and really can't be singularized that way, just as the individual experiences that we as people have. There may be commonalities amongst them. There may be common threads. And in fact, I would argue, particularly when it comes to toxic myths, there are common threads that occur, at least within Western culture, but they're not all identical. They are particularized because all of us are particularized.
Yeah. One thing that just popped up for me that I know, is dear to my heart and yours as well. You could say racism, slavery was a created toxic myth. Can you expound upon that so our audience, because I want to make sure they get this, that myths impact many areas of our lives.
Exactly. Let's talk about American slavery for a minute. And I say this with a lot of passion because I am biracial. I'm half Black. The idea of race as we conceptualize it in the United States is itself nothing more than a myth. It is a story. It is a social construct. Clearly, although I am of a different race than you, if we so chose, we could procreate and create a fertile child. So we're part of the same species. If you were to look at me and someone else who is Black, let's say Denzel Washington, he's a lot better looking than me. I think very few people would sit and say, oh, you all are identical. You all really are part of the same group. But based on skin color and physical characteristics, I probably actually look more like you than I do Denzel Washington, or maybe I'm somewhere distinctive on my own. But and you would be on that spectrum in a completely different place too. But in any event, that sort of the obviousness of those separations, once you're able to pull back away from social constructs and look at them, proves that these things are all just myths. I would argue that race as a construct in America is a very, very toxic myth, and it's corroded everything that we do, and it's corroded more lives than we can imagine. And it's played into, by the way, and created toxic myths that people have lived out on a personal level that if they're not able to overcome, can ultimately lead to a long-term personal myth that's tragic.
Yeah, and you're speaking my language on so many levels because I've lost so many friends to suicide and addictions and all of the things, and that's why I'm more of a voice now than ever because there was a time where I wanted to date Black men, and that was like a no-no, right? In my small rural Iowa farmland community, nothing but love for y'all out there if you're listening right now, nothing but love because I went through this journey. I even manifested an autoimmune disease in my throat. Remember, I shared that before with
vividly.
you because I was afraid to say I love Black people, and I I even married a Black man, but there was so much shame, and I had depression and fear of being judged because I was stepping outside the box, the myth, the story that was in my hometown, right?
Yeah.
Is we don't do that here. But then it impacted my health, it impacted my wealth, coming back to the theme of my podcast, Healthy and Wealthy and Wise. So this is a big deal.
Yeah, I completely agree. And these myths play out in a whole host of other different ways. As you know, as we've discussed, I don't keep this a secret. I am a member of the LGBTQ community. And the whole idea, and you saw this in some of the early US Supreme Court decisions around whether sodomy should be legal or not, or should be, whether there was a constitutional right for people to engage in consensual acts that were outside of heterosexual ones. There was this myth that throughout history, there's been this nuclear family that is heterosexual in its foundation, and that, you know, created a nurturing environment that led to ultimately the buildup of a healthy and prosperous larger culture. That itself is a myth. Those who actually have studied this will tell you that the story, particularly across cultures, is quite nuanced, varies massively depending on the time and location where you are, and isn't necessarily predicating anything on anything. And so again, you think about this, think about the suicide rate amongst the LGBTQ community, particularly teenagers, especially trans teenagers, is unbelievably high because of a myth. Because of a myth.
And it's funny, until I met you, I thought of myths as, I don't want to say lies per se, but as just fables, right? Or stories. And it's interesting because I grew up with the Bible, you know, and Christianity, religion, all that kind of stuff. Again, maybe we can expound and then go to why we're going into the Norse paganism story. But a lot of these myths that we grow up with, they're stories, but in some ways they're also not truth.
I argue that in many cases, the greatest truth is embedded within things that aren't. So I'll give an example. The Exodus story in the Bible. There has been extensive archaeological research around that story for decades. And for those, by the way, who might be so inclined, the books out there around the archaeology of the Old Testament, particularly with regards to the Exodus, fascinating. There has been, pretty much as long as the field of archaeology has existed, a drive to figure out exactly when the exodus from Egypt occurred, what pharaoh it was, what the trajectory of this was. And pretty much most archaeologists that truly have devoted their study to this and have looked for outside evidence outside of the Bible itself for this massive event have come up empty-handed. Now, some people find that outcome to be very threatening, because if the Exodus story is a myth, they would argue the very foundations of the Old Testament, and therefore the foundations of the New Testament upon which which is based on the Old Testament, then crumble, because the factual story isn't necessarily true. However, another argument would be that even if the Exodus never happened, it is a myth of profound resonance that talks to a profound variety of human conditions and provides profound, and has provided profound levels of motivation for positive cultural and social changes throughout history, not the least of which is, by the way, going back to what we talked about a minute ago, slavery and the emancipation here in the United States. as well as the fight against Jim Crow and things like that. I mean, the Black church here in the United States has its foundations, obviously, in Christianity, which has its foundations and used as its principal metaphor in the struggle against racism, the whole story of the Exodus in the Bible. So the story of the Exodus in the Bible may or may not be true. I think archaeologists that study it have a pretty strong opinion about which of those they believe.
Yeah.
But irrespective of that factual truth, what's the human truth there? I would argue that no one could really dispute that wrapped within even something that's a potential fiction is a very deep truism.
That's so powerful. Yeah, there's so much there. And I mean, we're talking about historical things, and there's even been things that have been hidden. Like the Vatican is now seeing Mary Magdalene as not a prostitute, but a saint, like a great teacher. Like, so there's things that are coming out of the woodwork now that a lot of us grew up with a certain myth or perception about certain things in the Bible or in our childhood, our upbringing, our social construct, that are now changing. Like there was books in the Bible that were destroyed also, right? That a lot of people never know about until they do research. And I think that's the important thing, guys, that I want to get across is it's like my kids going to a critical thinking school. They ask them, how do you know that you know?
Yeah.
How do you know that you know? Is it just because your parents told you, or it was a story that you read? Or are you willing to do the research, which I think a lot of us are either afraid to do because we don't know if we can handle the truth, right?
Yeah.
Because you even said that in your post on social media. And there's a quote, I always love to say this: the truth will set you free, but at first it'll piss you off. And I know that really, really happened for me many times in my life, as I know as it has for you. So I'm going to take a break and then you can answer. I don't want to.
Yeah.
I want to share.
No, thank you. And I could listen to you all day, and I'm sure the audience can too. I have to say, again, there's much embedded in what you just said that we could take off into a zillion different directions. And maybe one day we'll have a 10-hour podcast and just do that. But in the immediate time, I do have to say, just as a personal aside, then I'll get into a deeper statement. One of the things that always drove me crazy was when I was younger. My parents would say things like, well, that's not how we raised you. We didn't raise you to believe that. And I always thought that was ridiculous. Right? Like when I first came out as gay, that wasn't how we raised you. We raised you to be heterosexual and marry someone of the same race. And of course, I end up homosexual and married to someone of a different race. I would do that. But like, so what? You told me to believe it. I can think for myself. I'm not going to believe something just because mommy told me. And so, but as I've gotten older and wiser, I've realized to the extent to which the human mind is always seeking to conserve energy. If there is a basis for just believing something that saves time, doesn't require that mental exertion, many people are going to be so inclined to do it, and then that leads to them really being the sort of people, again, this part of just brain mechanics and energy conservation, that just believe what they're raised. And change is always potentially threatening. That's part of us having evolved on the African savanna, where we could be eaten at any moment. And so understanding and accepting that our situation has changed and that we have the capacity to assess risk puts us in a better position to then, I think, as you suggest, really think about why we're making assumptions other than just on instinct or because we want to save brain energy.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a good segue. Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you.
No, I don't want to just talk endlessly too, so please continue.
Yeah, because I think I want to get to the Norse paganism and why is Lois excited about this. And again, it wasn't something that I knew that you had a passion for. So I just love how the universe works. So part of, guys, just so you know, part of my journey, I had a very deep religion wound. And so I shut myself down from religion for about 14 years. And I knew that it was hurting me. My spiritual life was really, really shut down. Mind, body, spirit was not aligned. Now here I am coaching and helping people realign. Because once I realigned myself, the bliss, the joy, the authenticity, the depth of myself, and then my marriage, my relationships, everything in life, my career, just so beautiful. And I've been missing that. And part of that journey, when I worked through plant medicine, working with the ascended masters, having a different relationship with Jesus and Mary Magdalene and all these greats, right? And then one of my plant medicine teachers said, well, you've got Germanic paganism in your lineage, right? And these Norse pagans, like, have you studied them? And I'm like going, I thought I was not supposed to. I thought that was bad. But okay, maybe I should look into that, right? Because my mind and heart were now open to understanding my origins at a much, much deeper level. And so I started looking into Germanic paganism, and it was so beautiful. And the Norse, and you think about Marvel coming back with all of this, these movies, and even Wakanda, and showing all of those beautiful things from Africa, all of these beings, these ancestors who have been here. We are our ancestors. We're essentially recycling, and history repeats itself, right? And yet we're here to break those ancestral curses. So it was really profound for me to be able to heal that, what I call religion wound, and to go deeper back in time and understanding, like, oh my gosh, these Norse gods and these myths are just so beautiful. Now I want to bring it out to the world because it really changed my life.
Many of them, particularly the stories of the thunder god Thor, are pure entertainment, and in my opinion, some of the best action and adventure stories that have ever been documented. And they're funny, and they are vivid in their descriptions of a sort of alternate version of the world that we're living in. But others of the Norse myth stories are profound, and every bit as much as Greek, Egyptians, or other Middle Eastern traditions speak as to fundamentals. And I think that the vision that the Norse had of the world is actually, so the world that the Vikings inhabited was one that was harsh. The winters were long. There were periods in which there was not a lot of light, and particularly those that might have lived in the northern parts of Scandinavia or even parts of Iceland. Right, the physical landscape was severe and rugged, and life was a constant struggle for survival. And the tone and the symbology and the thinking about what spiritualism and what spirituality are that we have preserved in the surviving Norse myths really bring that to light in a different way than the myths that originated in more lush, temperate climates might have reflected. I also might add one thing that is very, very interesting about Norse paganism and the ancient Norse beliefs is that their gods were mortal, and some of them died during the mythical cycle. And that to me speaks as to perhaps something universal that the Greek, Egyptian, and other myths don't even touch, because all of their gods were immortal, representing, in my opinion, the immortality of the human, or the eternal nature and the universality of the human experience. But death is indeed a true unchangeable in the human experience.
Wow, I didn't even know that. I guess I didn't equate that because I'm new. You studied Greek mythology as part of your career, right?
I've basically, look, ever since I was a child, I've been reading up on Greek mythology, and I've studied it. I've read scholarly things and taken Greek religion classes in college and things like that my entire life. Am I a Harvard PhD in Greek mythology? No. I bring that into the personal transformation and professional development space. But it's interesting that you mentioned Greek mythology, because even before, or maybe around the same time that I discovered Greek mythology, the same authors that introduced me to Greek mythology had a book on Norse mythology that captivated me actually even more. And so I have also studied, read, reread, analyzed, took classes in Norse mythology for my entire life. And so, again, am I a PhD in Norse mythology? No. Am I familiar with these stories? Do I sympathize with them? Do they speak to me? Do I understand them? And have they brought change into my life that I feel the need to share with other people? Heck, yes.
And I know this is part of your professional career, and you're talking about leadership. And in your post, I just wanted to share this with people. If you didn't see, Scott tagged me in a post on social media. If you're tired of feeling trapped and stuck as a leader, or in an unfulfilling career path, which, hello, great resignation, hello,
right,
pandemic, waking the world up, and we're ascending into a whole new earth. So, how can these greatest fictions ever told help people find professional freedom? And then I want to talk about how it's also impacted my health and my career. But I want you to share.
Yeah, thank you. So, like I mentioned earlier, people have been studying myths for as long as they've been told, and they've been attempting to categorize them as long as they've been told as well. There is no canon, so to speak, of mythical categories. And I view that as a blessing, because it opens them to endless categorization. But as representatives of the human experience, it's my belief that there are 5 general types of myths that represent personal myths that we tell ourselves, which are toxic, and they appear in both Greek and Norse mythology. Number 1, I'll just briefly run through them. The tragic origin myth, which is when the circumstances of your birth or your early life ultimately dictate your life outcomes. Number 2 is the social myth, when you are engaging in behaviors based purely on the expectations of others. 3, the ritual myth, when you're repeating behaviors over and over and over again, even though they no longer have utility. 4 is the doomsday myth, which, by the way, the strongest doomsday myth that I know of is actually in Norse mythology. But that is when you believe that no matter what happens in your life, disaster, or whatever choices you make, disaster is going to happen. And then the 5th is the underworld myth, which is one you and I have lived and spoken about extensively. And again, is represented by a realm in Norse mythology, which is one in which there is hopelessness, spiritual, emotional, psychological darkness that you see no end to. So in terms of understanding myths, I recommend that my clients examine their own lives within the framework of these larger genres of myth, and then identify the roles that they are playing in them, whether their myths are toxic or not, and then spend some time digging deep so that they can write a new mythological foundation. In Norse mythology terms, the mythologies from the Vikings that we know about are by and large preserved in 2 documents called the Eddas, the prose Edda and the poetic Edda. So I would have my clients, if they were Norse mythology fans like you, rewrite a new Edda for their own future. The goal would be for them to ultimately build a vision of their own Valhalla that enables them to escape hell, which literally was the name of the Norse underworld, and enter into this Valhalla as a charismatic member of the Aesir, or the Vanir, if that's the tribe of gods that they preferred.
Yeah. Wow. Maybe because I know what you're talking about.
Yes.
So for others, it might be, pardon the expression, Greek to them, even though it's Norse, right? But what are the Eddas? What is Valhalla? Maybe explain, unpack a little bit more.
Happily. And thank you for your patience with that. So let's start with the Eddas. There are 2 Eddas, and they're basically books. The Poetic Edda is a series of poems by unknown authors that retell the Norse myths in Skaldic. Well, so the ancient Norse storytellers were called skalds, and they basically contained these myths in Skaldic form. And so that's the oldest and most authentic version of the myths that we have. There is a prose Edda, which is a book that includes a number of different things that was written by an Icelandic king who that basically wanted to preserve these myths of his forefathers because they were dying out. And so he wrote them down in edited form. Some of them are slightly different than the ones in the poetic Edda. Some of them are identical. Some of them are not known anywhere else. And, sadly, these are the only two big records that we have of this tradition that was massive. It's almost like we just had the Iliad and the Odyssey and absolutely nothing else about Greek mythology, or that we had the book of Joshua and the book of Kings and knew nothing else about the Old Testament. So that's what an Edda is. Valhalla. The Norse believed that the world was going to end and the gods were going to die. And so it was up to the individuals in that society to choose how they would live their lives and to try and do that in a way that was honorable and reflected the willingness to sacrifice literally themselves and their souls to be on the side of good when the world ended. And so if you died as a warrior, heroically, honorably representing the values of the gods, in other words, the values of the Viking people, then you went to Valhalla, and that's where you lived under the personal guidance of the chief god Odin, pretty much for all eternity. The two terms Aesir and Vanir that I used, I think you may find interesting as a plant medicine aficionado. So, I find this generally fascinating. There were actually two completely different groups of Norse gods. There were the Aesir, which were the ones that were the main people that we are familiar with, Odin, Thor. And they were the ones that represented governance and material success and war and conquest, as well as mastery. And by the way, the Eddas contain, these books that I mentioned earlier contain detailed histories of the Aesir. However, there was another group of gods called the Vanir. And no one knows who these people were or where they came from. They had their own realm. And literally, there's a story about how the very first Vanir that we know of just appeared one day at the door of the other gods. And there was like this whole shebang that happened between the two of them. But we don't know anything about the origin of these gods or where they came from. They represented things like magic, like fertility, like love, like all of the things that we might associate with a predominantly agricultural society. I actually relate strongly to the Vanir. The main Vanir god was Frey. Yeah. They call him in the Marvel movies Freyr, but his name was Frey. And he was the god of abundance, fertility, of light. And the goddess of love was Vanir. There was a god of skiing that they believed was a Vanir god, and of archery. And so those are some of the terms that I was using. And I think that that's an interesting sort of division. Are you one of these mysterious people that came out of nowhere? No one knows what your origin is, but you represent a connection to plants, to fertility, to love. I see a lot of that in you, frankly, Lois.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. I love that. Thank you. I love that. And I want to, if I can quickly share a little bit of how this has impacted my health and my career.
Please.
Understanding this. And I just have to show you, I'm reading this book right now by Diana Paxson, one of the best. And then I've also been inspired to study the runes and bringing back my Germanic divination gifts. So I'm super, super stoked to share that. And why is that important? And why am I talking about this on
well, who are we and why are we talking? What is this even about?
Well, I think a lot of us, we feel alone. We feel separate, especially like you and me, right? We're black sheep of the family. We think differently. And when I started to really see that I was different, I felt separate. I felt less than. My limiting beliefs, my subconscious fired on all cylinders. And that's what led me to be depressed and go through this whole separation of self and spirituality, because I just didn't understand it all. And what I didn't realize was that history, in essence, was kind of repeating itself, because when I started to study my ancestors, started to understand their own pain, their own trials, their tribulations, and then going all the way back to when Christianity came in and pushed out the Germanic pagans and the Vikings and all that kind of stuff. A lot of our origins come from back then.
Yeah.
And history has repeated itself. And that's why I think these gods and goddesses and mythologies are coming back to help us change as this new earth is birthing. And once I started realizing I'm not alone, I have all of these ancestors, I have all of these great lineages, these great powerful stories to hold myself up with, I felt more courage, I felt more joy. I started to speak my truth more. And over time, of course, with a lot of plant medicine and meditation and breath work and all of the things, as I purged this stuff from my system and my body, I started to love myself so much more. And to your point, when I started studying Freya in particular, the goddess, you have Frey and then you have Freya.
Yep.
They're all about that sacred union of the feminine and the masculine as well. And those energies were so powerful for me to really be more balanced in my brain and my body and my essence, my beingness. And yeah, getting back to literally the truth is not feast or famine. That's not who we are. That was a part of the journey that our ancestors went through, and what ironically, not surprisingly, we're still going through right now.
Yeah.
I think they're coming back to try to bring us all back to our true nature and to bring us all together. And we all are one. That's a lot for me to share. It's kind of all over the place, but
No.
maybe you can even help unpack that, because
Yes.
that's what it's done for me, and it's literally saved my life.
First of all, thank you for sharing that. It excites me and it explains a lot about us and about a lot of things that I'm going to tap into in just a second. But I will say my life passion is being part of bringing this back into the world so that the voices that these myths represent can be heard and in their own way help transform lives again. I find it to be no coincidence that you and I feel then like we're brothers, sisters from another mother. Think about it. Our avatar deities are literally brother and sister. Frey and Freya. Freya was the goddess of love, who you just mentioned, were literally siblings of this banner race that just popped out of nowhere and no one knows where they came from. A, I have to comment about that. B, talking about voices being silenced and Freya. And it's interesting that you mentioned Freya as your avatar, then showed me the book about Odin. And by the way, we're going to get, after this brief interlude here, we're going to get into connecting Odin with the book of runes that you just showed, because that's something that's significant.
And he's connected to Jesus too. I mean, anyway, we'll
he is, and we will talk about that.
Yeah.
If the conversation goes that way. One thing that's significant to think about, pagan religions like the Vikings, Viking mythology, had rich pantheons of gods and goddesses. And think about this. In history, in the Middle East, there were originally a pantheon of Middle Eastern deities that included a female consort of the chief god that we later came to know as the God of the Old Testament. Now, this goddess, and by the way, the Bible, the Old Testament, explicitly talks about the efforts that the priests in ancient Israel and Judah had to try and smash down the worship of this deity. We could talk about that female deity at length in another iteration, but suffice it to say, it's not so unreasonable to conclude that that deity was actually more or less equivalent of Freya.
Okay.
Now, what did that represent? Many would argue that the elevation of a single male deity represents a devaluation of the status of individuals, because if a god is to represent, and the myths of a society are to represent how that people define themselves, then on some level or another, the choice to have a male deity makes a profound statement as to how that society is defining itself. Whereas if a society has a robust pantheon that includes men and women, it's also making a statement about the place of the feminine and of women directly within that cultural identity. Freya is of profound significance in this way. Freya, I mentioned earlier, those that died as warriors, i.e., who were living out the Norse cultural ideals, went to Valhalla. I actually simplified things a little bit too much because actually only 50% of them went to Odin's Hall, Valhalla. The other 50% went to the Hall of Freya. Freya wasn't just the goddess of magic, love, and beauty. She was also a goddess of war.
Or, yeah.
And so that also goes as to then, well, what is the real connection between war, striving, hearing your voice, being able to be a representative on the force of good, the duality of what love can be, tender, leading to fertility, but also potentially leading to conflict. And think about what that means when we consider how familial relationships play out, how society and patriarchal family units treat the female voices within them, and how then, as a society moved away from more pagan oriented belief systems into a more monotheistic system with a deity specifically identified as male. Well, what does that really say about the status of women? How do women incorporate those beliefs into their programming? And then what does that say about the feminine voice? Not coincidentally, in Norse mythology, the goddess of the dead was also a woman.
Yeah.
As we mentioned, her name was Hel. And Hel, her forces at the end of the world were no less powerful than those of the gods. And not only that, but she even, as I mentioned earlier, was able to claim some of the gods because the Norse gods were mortal. So let's talk, if I may, unless you want to respond to that, because I do want to talk about Odin and the runes.
Yeah, I don't want to go too much here, just to say also that the perception of hell also is very different than what we've learned in Christianity too. So I don't know if you want to speak to that really briefly, and then let's keep going back to Odin and the runes.
Yeah, great point. In the Norse hell, you basically were a fluttering soul that lived in a space of darkness forever. And it was not torture unless you were really evil, but there was a whole separate realm for that. If you were just an ordinary person that, like, let's say, died in childbirth or of old age, you went to hell and you spent all eternity there. Now, the spirits of the dead in Norse mythology were not particularly grateful for that, and that's why at the end of the world, they ultimately ended up creating a ship made out of the nails of corpses, the fingernails and toenails, and fighting against the gods. And to me, there's a lot of symbolism there about, well, how we truly treat those who may not have access to certain ways of behaving within a culture, and the fact that we may make cultural decisions and make value judgments around those decisions and encourage people to do whatever, but injustice doesn't stand forever. Just something to think about.
Yeah, for sure. That's amazing. Gosh, I think we could have 5 episodes here, but I know I'm watching my time. I do got to keep moving. So talk about the importance of the myth around Odin and the runes and how that helps us today.
Odin was the chief of the gods. He was the equivalent of the universe's CEO. And he had a whole staff of gods and spirits and elves and things like that to help him run it. And he had competitors that he had to fight, the frost giants that were always seeking to overturn and be the dominant business in the ancient Norse world. And he understood that strength represented by the god Thor wasn't enough, nor was pure intellect. He needed wisdom. And so what Odin did was go to the tree that basically held the entire world together. And over that tree was a well that was guarded over by the fates. And he hung himself on that tree, and he got a spear and he stabbed himself with it. And he hung on that tree for 9 days, willing to sacrifice himself. Important language here. He was willing to sacrifice himself to himself so that he could gain wisdom. And on the 9th day, he looked down into the waters of that well and he saw the runes and he understood them. That was wisdom. My belief is that the runes represent the inner language that we all speak, that many of us cannot understand unless we are willing to sacrifice all that we are or all that we were, and there they are.
Yeah, just to give you guys, this is older than tarot. It's and it's not like forecasting / psychic stuff. It's what I love about this is talking about wisdom, and it's obvious to me that that's why my podcast is actually called Healthy and Wealthy and Wise, because what they're trying to teach us is we have all the answers inside of us, and sometimes you need help. And so these symbols came along way before tarot, and we're here to help people with introspection and getting messages from that divine spirit, whatever you want to call that again. So I love them. I use them now every day, and it gives me so much clarity, direction, support. And I don't know if you want to say anything more about why they were so powerful for Odin. I kind of interjected there.
No, I love, basically you said it. They were the inner voice. They gave him the ability to have wisdom. They were the ones that made him the all-father of the universe. Odin had 2 brothers that were up until that point more or less co-equals with him. Not anymore. And a lot of the myths around Odin relate to him seeking deeper wisdom. The Norse were big, and there was a whole other separate god of wisdom called Kvasir. And he himself like couldn't die, although he was killed at one point. And so I think that what you're talking about goes us to a deep understanding, the runes representing this voice within, this intuition, this secret knowledge that we can have access to, but that we have to be willing to sacrifice something. To me, the idea of Odin sacrificing himself to himself represents the willingness to destroy the ego that keeps us from being able to look beyond ourselves so that we could access and understand the runes, is what that story is really all about. And it truly is universal.
Yeah, and I know I might be stirring the pot here a little bit, guys, but it's okay. I'm okay doing this. But they often compare now Woden's hanging on the tree to Jesus and his own self-sacrifice, and there's some parallels there. Maybe we can finish unpacking that comparison, if that would be okay.
It is interesting, because although the historical tradition in Christianity of Jesus hanging on the cross has the image like this that we all recognize, and you see on necklaces and on church stained glass and all of that, it's actually ambivalent as to what that thing was that he died on. And some have literally interpreted it as really being a tree. And once you're willing to then understand that, what do trees represent in the mythological mind? Trees are a fairly obvious symbolic significance, although, right, they represent fertility, they represent timelessness, they represent rootedness and connectedness with the earth. In the case of the Norse myths, they represent the foundations of the world going all the way up to the top of the skies. And they represent seasonality. They represent everything that's timeless within the human experience. Wisdom isn't just knowledge, as the story of Odin represents. It is something beyond. It is the connection with awareness or information or the ability to process experience that's timeless. Christ hung on some sort of wooden object, a tree, or a symbolic substitute for it. What did he gain He gained, of course, the ability to save us, but he also got the power of God in a way that if he had not been willing to make that sacrifice for himself, we don't know whether he would have ever really had, right? That was part of why we worship him as a divinity, is he was willing to make the ultimate sacrifice. Go back to the book of Genesis. Think about what was in the Garden of Eden. There was a tree of knowledge of good and evil. There was the tree of life.
Life, yeah. That's what I think of now is the tree of life. Yggdrasil, of course, that's what they called it with Odin. That tree of life, there's so much symbolism there, and it goes along really well with plants and the ancestral roots. You think about the tree, and the roots are so deep, and is the foundation for our lives in so many aspects. I love it.
When Adam and Eve ate of the tree of knowledge and good and evil, think about it. They understood good and evil, which meant they gained knowledge, but they were never able to eat from the tree of life. They were not able to just grab the wisdom of the divine. They had to go out into the world, had to face it. Humanity wasn't able to get it on its own. Symbolically, at least to my ears and eyes, the sacrifice of a deity on a tree was what was necessary for humanity to have salvation. In other words, for humanity to have wisdom, to ultimately reconnect with the divine.
I love it, which is what's happening here in the world now, guys. I know some people call it Age of Aquarius. My metaphysical friends call it period 9. Some people call it divine feminine rising. I think that's why these topics are coming up now more and more, is people are recognizing and coming back to the points of origin. I just want to make a quick announcement, and then any closing thoughts for you. And it's actually really cool. I didn't do this on purpose, guys, but I know this upcoming week is Fat Tuesday, Ash Wednesday, the kickoff of Lent. If you observe it, you don't even have to be religious. A lot of people observe it just as a time of 40 days of sacrifice. We're talking about sacrifice, giving up something to connect with that divine within. And maybe you don't look at it that way, but I'm going to encourage you to maybe consider looking at it that way, because I have on Monday kicking off a 40-day challenge. And it's not actually about abstinence or giving things up. It's actually about busting through your addictive behaviors. And I know we didn't get there, but I thought it was interesting when you said, talking about social myths, ritual myths, we're going to be working through a lot of those types of things, people pleasing, alcohol, sugar, emotional eating, codependent behaviors that are holding you back in your health and your wealth. We're going to work through those over the next 40 days. So I hope you guys can consider. It's not too late to sign up. You can even sign up through March 1st, but helping you through this Lenten season, again, if you observe it. If not, just helping you dig deeper to find that divinity within, to find that internal wisdom, to stop. A lot of times people look for addictive behaviors because they're looking outside of themselves for answers. And it doesn't have to be abstinence unless you choose it to be. I just want to help change your paradigm and help you get to the root cause of those, because that's what I've spent the last 2 years doing, and help you do it with or without plant medicine, of course. Check out that link, 40-day-challenge.now.site, and I'd love to have you be a part of that journey with me, and breaks through some of those myths, actually, of those addictive behaviors. So, Scott, I'd love for you to share any closing thoughts, anything that's on your heart this last minute.
Look at the toxic myths that are holding you back, dislodge them, and make your future epic.
I love it. I love it. Where can people find you, Scott? And I'll make sure I put that also, besides Webdelics podcast, but where would you like people to get in touch with you?
Thank you. myfreedomrocks.com, myfreedomrocks.com, myfreedomrocks.com. You can also find me on LinkedIn at s.scottmason or the Myth Slayer, and on Instagram at s.scott_mason, s.scott_mason.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much for opening our minds today, for really helping my audience hear something they've never heard before. And I'm so grateful that Odin and Freya brought us back together.
Exactly.
And until next time, guys, I'll be talking over the next week or so about my 5 fundamentals to your best health, your best wealth, inside of my 40-day challenge, but also healthy and wealthy and wise and the movement that I'm creating. If you saw value in this show today, as always, please hit the share button. Sharing is caring. And until next time, guys, signing off for healthy and wealthy and wise. Here's your best health, your best wealth, and finding that best wisdom within. Bye-bye for now.